Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein, Dick Fuld, Ken Lewis, Jimmy Kane, John Thain, Bob Diamond, Greg Lippman, Hank Greenberg, Chuck Prince. Not guilty. Though the weight of their bogus financial products collapsed the entire global financial system and turned much of the world's population into indentured servants, to the never-ending bailouts, bail-ins of their crimes, not one has faced any form of justice. But as Frederick Douglass once said, where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to repress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. Stacy.
No way. And a lot of people in America are now starting to notice this rise in injustice, which is arising along with the wealth and income gap. And including Matt Taibbi, formerly of Rolling Stone magazine. He's written a new book called Divide American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap. And he notes that, for example, even during the 80s, we still had a relative amount of justice in that 1,000 bankers went to jail. Then cut to this clip from Democracy Now!
You fast forward 10 or 15 years to the accounting scandals like Enron and Adelphia and Tyco. We went after the heads of some of those companies. It wasn't as vigorous as the SNL prosecutions, but we at least did it. At least George Bush recognized the symbolic importance of showing ordinary Americans that justice is blind, right? And fast forward again to the next big crisis, and how many people have we got? Have we actually put in jail? Zero. And this was a crisis that was much huger in scope than the SNL crisis or the accounting crisis. I mean, it wiped out 40% of the world's wealth, and nobody went to jail. So that we're now in a place where we don't even recognize the importance of keeping up appearances when it comes to making things look equal.
Well, the connection between finance and justice is an interesting one, and that there's a connection between financial inequality and injustice. And at first you see the financial inequality, and it leads to social injustice. And as was said a couple hundred years ago, when the social contract is broken, there must be a revolt. I believe that's a John Locke quote preceding all the revolutions that ensued after the Enlightenment. The population in America and Britain have yet to have their enlightened moment where they discover en masse that they've had their societies ripped from them by crooks who first stole the money using all the techniques we've been talking about on the show for years, and now facing a form of new poverty, a poverty of justice, where cops, who are not even identifying themselves as cops, in New York City, mug people on the street and steal their stuff. And this is a growing trend in America. Unidentified cops stopping people on the highway, stopping people in New York City, stealing their cash, stealing their goods. So it's become like Clockwork Orange in this sense. No justice. It's completely predictable.
Now, all of the CEOs of the banks or heads of divisions of banks that you mentioned in the opening, they all received huge bailouts. They received gifts from the taxpayer. And yet, they never endured what Matt Taibbi covers happens, for example, in San Diego. If you receive any welfare, what they're doing is they're sending cops to these single mothers' homes to look and make sure that they don't have any boyfriends. And what they're doing is the cops are opening up their panties drawers to see if there are any underwear in there and holding them up if they look sexy and saying, why do you need sexy underwear if you don't have any partner to help you out? Why are you receiving this welfare? So does that happen to Jamie Dimon? Do they go looking for women's underwear in his drawers?
Well, again, the analogy to Clockwork Orange is an apt one. The droogs that were looking for ultraviolence, remember, they were cops or wannabe cops. And this is what we have now in America, is a disenfranchised class that has been left out of the wealth aggregation through theft, modeled by Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein, who feel they need to take a piece for themselves, so they just go around the countryside or the cities and they clock people over the head, they steal, they rape.
Also, the bankers in the top of the show that you said, they defrauded basically the global population through CDOs, through collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities and things like that. They defrauded passive investors like pension funds. Now, the next wave that's been happening, or they claim to be investigating, is this high-frequency trading. And what that is doing is basically front-running slow investors, people who are, aren't paying to access the information fast enough. Well, the dubious new high-frequency trading case against the Merc being the Mercantile Exchange in Chicago. For all of the outrage kicked up by Michael Lewis's depiction of fundamentally rigged securities exchanges in his book Flash Boys, there's a giant obstacle standing in the way of punishing high-frequency traders or the exchanges that facilitate them: the blessing of federal regulators. As DealBook's Peter Henning wrote in his White Collar Crime Watch column on why high-frequency trading is unlikely to result in criminal charges, securities exchanges openly sell access to high-speed data feeds and to physical proximity that increases trading speed by milliseconds.
Well, I mean, before the Michael Lewis book came out, Flash Boys, people have been talking about the theft of high-frequency trading. We have on this show for several years. And, of course, what the bankers will say, like a Lloyd Blankfein on the Charlie Rose Show, which is a show on public television in America. He'll claim that the bank, Goldman Sachs, is making a market or providing liquidity. Those are buzzwords for I'm stealing with reckless abandon from the American people and causing social injustice and cops beating folks over the head and stealing and raping them. That's the subtext of Lloyd Blankfein's message to Charlie Rose. And if Charlie Rose, of course, is an establishment hack who's got his thumb up his schwing, who won't do any follow-up questions at all to Lloyd Blankfein, and that's a unconscionable, shameless act of cowardness by Charlie Rose and all the mainstream media except Matt Taibbi, who's got the cojones to say what needs to be said.
Again, as this woman points out, it's open. So basically she likens it to buying a seat on an airplane, and they're openly offering to everybody first-class tickets. If you want to pay more for the data to be given to you faster, that's okay. It's not against the law.
No, that's completely false, because the idea of free market capitalism is the price discovery mechanism, which is a result of buyers and selling coming into the marketplace per Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand. If you're paying for front row seats to grab data ahead of other players in the market, that's no longer free market capitalism. That's a kleptocracy. Whoever made that comment should be flayed in public, the skin ripped off, like an episode from Game of Thrones, and then their heads chopped off and then put on a spike and then on by the general population, because they are a traitor to everything anyone holds sacred in America.
Okay, well, that's a bit extreme. Maybe you should join with the biggest a-hole in America as he goes by, and this is Weev. He was released from prison early because he was sentenced to 41 months in prison for exposing security holes in AT&T's servers that publicly revealed iPad addresses, email addresses for their users. And because he revealed this information, he was charged under the CFAA, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He's now out, and he says Weev talks about life in prison and his plans to open a hedge fund, TRO LLC. So my business model is short equities. I'm here to shift the market cap of publicly traded companies downward by publicizing problems in their technical infrastructure. Very few people manage to do this. In fact, besides the times I've done so, I can only think of a handful of other incidences. TJX, Target, Lulsex, Sony incidents. I think I might be the only person to do this more than once. I am able to cause impact precisely because I am so polarizing. Eyeballs are attracted to what I do because lots of people very viscerally dislike me.
Well, Weev is a genius. We love him. He's a little mistaken on the history of this, of course. We introduced the idea in 2002 with KarmaBank.com, the idea of creating a hedge fund that would talk about where companies are vulnerable based on the true information of what they're doing, shorting those stocks, and then passing on the incremental gains to the victims of these companies. For victims of Coca-Cola, victims of Monsanto, victims of Exxon would be awarded based on shorting their stocks. And then after that, the Animal Liberation Front in the UK also was very active in publishing 10Ks and 10Qs, or annual reports of companies that talked about the actual risk of animal testing in a real way that pension funds had to take notice. Then we had Anonymous. The group Anonymous last year came out with the idea of a hedge fund tied to the same kind of thing, talking about the real risks on the balance sheets. Now, by the way, the Washington Legal Foundation wrote a legal opinion about this technique back when we launched Karma Bank back in 2002, and their conclusion was that this was absolutely legal and should be welcomed by all capitalists. So this is pro-capitalism. It adds price discovery, the thing that's lacking from the marketplace. It overruns not only the machinations of Wall Street to trade purely on fraud by introducing legitimate price discovery, but it also attacks high-frequency traders because you're actually adding sellers to the marketplace where right now the sellers are completely unrepresented at all.
Now remember, he was sentenced to 41 months because of they say they charge him with crimes, the CFAA, which is Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Now I want to read the Wikipedia on what high-frequency trading is. High-frequency trading is a type of algorithmic trading, specifically the use of sophisticated technological tools and computer algorithms to rapidly trade securities. Computer algorithms, sophisticated computer algorithms. Now the CFAA, in particular, charges anybody who uses a computer using sophisticated means. So therefore, the likes of Aaron Swartz was charged not because he hacked, he didn't do that, but he used a sophisticated algorithm to download all the JSTOR documents at one time. And you know, the prison sentence is very large, and that's how they go after the likes of Jeremy Hammond. They say, you're going to be charged with CFAA, it's going to increase your sentence to decades in prison unless you plead guilty to this lesser crime. So in terms of this injustice in America, why doesn't Eric Holder go after these bankers using all of their CFAA, their computer fraud and abuse crimes, and say, plead guilty to the lesser one and you won't do 100 years in prison?
I'll tell you what, it goes back to John Poindexter, who came out with the policy analysis market, which was a prediction market based on my technology and my patented technology, patent number 5950176, the virtual specialist technology, which I patented in 1996. And he was going to create a terror futures market to predict where terrorists would strike next. Way before Jim Rickards came out in his book, Death of Money, talking about trading options and tracking options about where terrorists would hit. John Poindexter, with his policy analysis market, had the idea 10 years before, which is based on my technology and my idea from 18 years ago. And so the reason why you won't see what you just described being carried through, that is to say, go after high-frequency traders for violating sophisticated trading laws as it relates to computer algorithms, is because, according to John Poindexter and the defense industry and the Department, they're protecting against terrorism. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Like they'll say, we're fighting terrorism, so we're innocent of all the crimes we commit.
Yeah, but again, this is the unequal application of the law against the likes of Weev.
There is no law! There is no law! America is a lawless cesspit of whores and bankers led by Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon. It's a confederacy of whores. Jamie, thank you so much for turning my country into a dog squirt. All right. Thanks so much. We'll see you later.
Ciao.
Stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to San Francisco Bay Area and speak with journalist and radio show host JP Sottile, whose recent piece for The Ecologist magazine is called Ukraine, Chevron, Condi Rice, and Shale Gas. So, JP, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Good to be with you, Max.
Okay, so why don't we just start connecting the dots? Ukraine, Chevron, Condi Rice, shale gas. How do you connect it all?
Well, it's actually not that hard. On November 5th, Chevron announced a 50-year deal to develop shale gas in Ukraine. It's up to $10 billion deal by the time it's over with. And as everybody, I think, knows by now, one of the bones of contention with Russia, Europe, and its transit point, Ukraine, is Russia's domination of the natural gas market in Europe. So I thought it was very interesting when the deal was announced that Chevron was involved in developing shale gas in Ukraine. Now that would have been with the previous government of Yanukovych, and I believe that that led to a lot of the pressure coming out of Moscow for Yanukovych to reject the economic deal between Ukraine and Europe. And that then, of course, led to a cascading number of events, which led to the deposing of Yanukovych and the crisis in Ukraine, as it is now called.
Okay, now let's talk about the natural gas business in Ukraine. 90% of Ukraine's oil and gas production comes from the east along the Russian border. So which gas reserves of shale gas is Chevron focusing on right now, hoping to exploit? The ones in the east, or I believe there's some in the west as well?
No, they're going for those eastern fields, and also you have to keep in mind that Chevron is heavily invested also in the Caspian Sea oil and gas area, heavily invested in Kazakhstan, which of course is another former satellite of the Soviet Union, former satellite of Russia, and also Exxon is involved in dealing with those gas reserves, trying to develop those gas reserves.
Right, and of course, when you speak about Chevron, Condoleezza Rice's name comes up. She's been involved in the oil patch for quite some time. She was with George W. Bush, of course. He was part of Texas and the oil industry in America, big oil. So can you just talk a little bit more about how she fits into the puzzle?
Well, you know, it was also interesting that former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, former board member of Chevron for just over a decade. As a matter of fact, when she joined the Bush administration as a national security advisor, at that time, Chevron had a tanker, a 192,000-ton tanker named the Condoleezza Rice. About 3 months after she joined the Bush administration, they decided to rename the tanker because they thought it was maybe a little bit untoward to have a tanker roaming around the world with the name of the national security advisor on it. She wrote an op-ed once the Ukraine crisis started, after the EU deal was rejected. And in this op-ed, she, of course, determined that the United States was not doing its job on the world stage as a world leader and world power by stopping the aggressive tactics of Russia and Vladimir Putin. Of course, she has a bit of an interest, being a former Chevron board member, and at the end of that op-ed for the Washington Post, she also mentioned that it would be great if the United States could keep 10,000 troops permanently in Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan, not known for its oil and gas reserves and riches, but is also strategically located for the TAPI pipeline, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. And right now, Chevron is negotiating to run that pipeline once it is built.
Well, certainly the dots, as you are connecting them, we start to see the picture. Added to the picture, JP, we have to look at beyond just the big oil. We're talking about Cargill and Monsanto, or big agriculture. They've got big plans for Ukraine. Tell us about that.
Well, this is where it all comes together, because Condi Rice is often thought of as a neocon. Another neocon would be Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan's wife is Victoria Nuland. I think Victoria Nuland would be now sort of known to most people as the woman who famously said on a phone call that Russia could the European Union, in relation to what was going on in Ukraine, that the European Union could do something to itself. I think roger itself would be another way of putting it. Well, Victoria Nuland also on December 13th went to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and talked about how the United States spent $5 billion helping Ukraine achieve its European aspirations. Well, she's connected to Cargill through something called the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. Well, how does this connection work out? The U.S.-Ukraine Business Council is an investor in the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, where Ms. Nuland was speaking on December 13th. And also on December 13th, that was the day that Cargill invested in a Black Sea port to help open the Russian market to its agriculture. Well, Cargill is also heavily invested in Ukraine in a company called Ukraland Farming. They just bought a $200 million stake in Ukraland Farming. As a matter of fact, they bought that stake, or it was announced, on the very day, January 12th of this year, that 50,000 Ukrainians flooded Kiev to protest the government of Yanukovych. They're all connected through Freedom House, a guy there who worked with Ms. Nuland, who is Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. She had a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, a guy named David Kramer. David Kramer serves on, he's actually head of Freedom House. Freedom House is one of the organizations that the United States uses to stoke democracy movements around the world. It is actually responsible, along with the National Endowment for Democracy, for funding many of the opposition forces there in Ukraine. And David Kramer also serves on the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. If you go to the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, which is a very interesting organization, on the executive board of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, you will find Cargill, Monsanto, John Deere, CNH International, which is a farming equipment and tractor making company, Eli Lilly, and DuPont Pioneer, DuPont Pioneer being the genetically modified organisms and agricultural wing of DuPont. And they all serve together under the guidance of a guy named Morgan Williams. Morgan Williams is CEO and president of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, and he has been a fixer for Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, other big agricultural companies in Ukraine for the last 15 to 20 years.
Right. I mean, this is fantastic journalism on your part, putting together connecting all the dots. Let me put it to you very simply. In your view, are U.S. corporations in the process of attempting a coup in Ukraine?
Well, that's an interesting question. This is something that's gone on in U.S. foreign policy for the better part of 100 and 125 years since the open door policy in China at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Of course, you have the United Fruit Company in the 1950s, taking over the banana plantations of Guatemala. You have United Fruit Company heavily invested in the sugarcane plantations of Cuba at the time of the Cuban Revolution. And I think right now what you have in Ukraine was formerly known as the breadbasket of Russia. It accounted for about a quarter of all the food that folks in the Soviet Union ate. It is famous for its black, fertile soil, a rich, deep soil. And interesting to note that in 2013, the Ukrainian agricultural economic sector had over 13% growth, which is stunning, Max, as I'm sure you can think about it in terms of economic growth worldwide, 13.7% growth. And in this coming year, this year that we're now, it was projected last year for 2014, that meat exports were going to rise by over 8%, pork exports were going to rise by over 70%, and big ag, American agricultural corporations, are trying to get into this former breadbasket of Soviet Union. It is perfectly positioned there between Russia and Europe, also the former Stans to the south, to be a huge exporter of meat, a huge exporter of grain, of corn and wheat. It's actually the third largest corn and wheat producer in the world. And the company that Cargill bought announced the buy on the 13th of this year, Ukraland Farming, is the world's 8th largest cultivator and its 2nd largest egg producer. So when you look at where the money is there in Ukraine's agricultural sector, which is interesting because we tend to focus on oil and gas, and we don't really think about agriculture as such a rationale for military or democracy-stoking interventions. But I think that this agricultural market is so hot, American agricultural corporations really want to get in there.
Right. Now, JP, you mentioned United Fruit Company's involvement in the Guatemala. Of course, they changed their name, I believe, to Chiquita yep. Banana. And this, of course, is the beginning of decades of the U.S. empire, U.S. hegemony, U.S. dollar reserve as global reserve currency. And if you go to Guatemala and you go to South America, you look at what's happened in Iran, you look at what's happened in other countries around the world, that steamroller of U.S. hegemony around the world, it's never really met any significant resistance. Are we at the point where this U.S. empire hegemony machine, industrial, the military-industrial complex, they've now running into Russia. They've got to deal with China, Russia, China, Iran. So this is now shaping up to be a bit of a battle royale. How would you handicap this as a betting man? It seems like so far the U.S., particularly with the Victoria Nuland's captured voicemail, where she's just outright trying to become the puppet master and install a fake dictator in Ukraine. It seems as though this U.S. multi-decade empire-building story might be heading to its end game. Your thoughts? Well,
I'm trained as an historian and I'm a journalist. It's hard for me to project the future. I would say this, story out today, that the United States is still the global leader in military expenditures, dwarfing the next 4 to 6 military budgets combined. I think when you spend the amount of money that the United States spends on military, it's hard to bet against that. I mean, if we're talking about stock market investments or handicapping the commodities markets in the future, the United States has some staying power. But I think what we're seeing here is what some people call a multipolar world. So it's hard to say. I think what you do see here with what is happening with Russia and also the power that China has over the U.S. economy with its through debt and the control of production of consumer goods, that the United States is now not as free to operate as it may have been in the past. It certainly is not as free to operate as it did in Iraq, because I don't think that Iraq could happen again.
All right, JP, we got to cut it there. We're out of time. But thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, JP Sottile. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.